quite amazing to be in a conference situation after what we've been through in the past few years, but it's so great to see all of you here. Just thanks to everyone to be here today. Actually, you've got 3 choices. Thanks for choosing me. Who am I? So I'm Mark White, one of the principal engineers, one of 6 working at Dunelm currently. JavaScript background with a slight passion for event-driven architecture. Been at Dunelm for about 4 years. So what I'm going to take you through the next 40-ish minutes maybe is I've been a large part of, apart from the initial decision, which I'll go into in a second, and then I've got about 11 years industry experience. So hopefully that'll be in good stead to go through what we are today. So people that aren't familiar with Dunelm, we are a homewares market leader. We've got around 180 stores nationally, which are bricks and mortar stores, and we're founded in the Midlands in 1979. But less about the bricks and mortar stores, more into the technical and why I'm here today. So I'm going to talk through some of the technical challenges we faced on the journey towards a serverless platform, and also some of the culture and mindset shifts that may have not been as obvious when we approached the question of how do we go serverless, and how we've kind of tackled those through many different conversations, through learning, through seriously steep learning curves, and things like that. So, and part of the blurring of the line between technology and the culture that we have today. So the 2 key themes I'm going to try and touch on today are the culture and mindset and shift across all areas of Dunelm. It wasn't just a technical change that we've seen, it's been across the business, which is fantastic. And a technical approach and the journey to achieve serverless, because I don't think it has always been as smooth as it could have been. So way back in July 2018, we were not given, but we came to the conclusion that our target architecture would be serverless because of many of the benefits that many of you may be aware of from AWS, which is remove self-provisioning, AWS handling all of the scaling that is quite a nice thing to take a load off your mind, and then some of the maintenance as part of the pillars that we've seen from the well-architected framework. For us, serverless meant that we were going to be going all the way into Lambda and event-driven architecture, and not into Kubernetes or Docker. We were going all in with the AWS resource suite at the time, which I'm quite happy that it's expanded since we initially picked it up. But I'm going to go through this talk, and maybe I may use serverless and event-driven architecture interchangeably, because going serverless for us was a huge catalyst towards achieving event-driven architecture. But at the time in 2018, we've since learned that many companies were also thinking about the same decision, whether they should go with a cloud provider using Docker, Kubernetes to maintain a level of multi-cloud provider options, or whether they should go all in. Now, some of those companies have been hugely successful using Docker and Kubernetes. Others may have now made the move into serverless. But it was a challenge. It was a difficult decision to make to get us there. So what did we start from? Because there was obviously a reason we needed to pick a new direction. So over the course of the years, Dunelm has made multiple acquisitions with world stores, with Kiddie Care, and that brings with it some baggage, some merging, some crazy processes that may exist for one reason or another. But not only did it bring 3 companies into one, it also brought a large technical estate that was existing in Docker. We had IBM third-party sources, we had PHP, and we had on-prem data centers that were all floating around in various different companies that were merged into Dunelm. And it's probably worth pointing out here, at this point in time, we didn't actually have an internal engineering capability. So anything we needed to change, any features we wanted to add, any downtime we saw, we needed to reach out to a third party and rely on the contractual SLAs that they put in place when the contract was signed. But more to that, as a platform, it wasn't scalable to the future we wanted to make. It was prone to failure in certain areas, those peak times, those sale times, those massive stock changes when we changed the seasons. Also, there was a long mean time to recover. So if something did go down, how did we know who to contact, when to contact them, and ultimately who was going to fix it? The platform itself and the third parties we were using at the time meant that the deployment frequency was about 2 times a month, which I'm glad to report that isn't the case today. 2 times a month for changes or even fixes was quite a painful process. But ultimately, when the platform did see a deployment through fairly inconsistent deployment methods, and that meant people had knowledge in their heads. There was various run books. There was various different race conditions between the systems. That meant we had to deploy things in a certain order over a certain period of time, and often meant working out of hours, weekends, etc., for those people that were involved. But even once it was deployed, there wasn't a real huge sense of confidence that the feature, the fix, would have worked without an extensive testing suite, which may have included a lot of manual testing. At the time, end-to-end testing, automated testing wasn't a huge thing within the platform. But as we move forward, upon the recognition of all of these challenges we're seeing with our current platform, we were able to deliver the question of where are we going next, and coming to the conclusion of serverless with a pre-approved re-platform roadmap, both for the platform itself and for the website. At the time, we were using IBM Web Commerce and needed to move away for various different things and to progress the business into a more agile state. So how do we start? Back in 2018, if any of you were looking into serverless at that point, the documentation or examples that are available today via things like serverless lands was just not available. So we were very much looking into limited knowledge. There was limited expertise around the business, around our business. There was limited expertise around the technical community. But we needed to understand how we could weave in the technical estate that we wanted to achieve in serverless, but also align to business aspirations, because we wanted to not only replace like for like, but grow both online and in store and as a brand. So we needed to answer the simple questions. People that were familiar with deploying huge monolithic applications, the trend didn't lend itself towards deploying a small serverless application like Lambda, or how the services were to stand up together and how that was to get there, how the deployment would work. So really teasing out what it meant to be serverless in the retail sector. So how do we tackle this? Those words probably look quite familiar from an agile perspective. So we wanted to try agile. We were going full agile. So we wanted to be iterative about our solution. We didn't want to boil the ocean. We didn't want to pick anything that was going to take too long to deliver and be too costly if it was going to ultimately fail. So maximum value was something we really wanted to tease out. But maximum value wasn't just a pound notes. It was also meaning efficiency, productivity, because ultimately those downtimes that we saw, those longer deployment frequencies, they all cost money. So also back to the smallest chunk, we wanted to reduce the blast radius of any of the changes we made, and we believed that serverless was going to be an enabler for us to achieve this, and also be really certain of the requirements to create a really microservice as we went along. So now to some loose diagrams of our architecture. So back in 2018, we had something that probably resembles this. So a large application with a few modules here and there talking to each other very internally. We had a presentation layer which the customer would interact with, and there was probably a lot of back office systems as well, pulling reports, CSVs, Excel spreadsheets, etc. But I'm going to focus on the big, large module A, B, and C as we move forward. So once we chose how to move forward from IBM Web Commerce, we started to build out a microservice architecture. The React application was our chosen front-end new UI. As I mentioned, it was pre-approved in the roadmap. That's probably the last I'm going to say about the React application, because that's a whole different talk in itself. So we started to build on what we thought we knew, pulling on the expertise from the business and the expertise from the technical community. So we built a product service, and then slowly built out all the capabilities that we believed that were required to achieve an approved MVP between the business stakeholders and the technical community to enable us to shift that traffic across the React application, because ultimately biting off anything from the larger application wasn't really an option. So in September 2019, we believed we had the feature parity, agreed with what wasn't going to make the cut for an MVP to relaunch Dunelm.com. So we switched across the traffic, removing the presentation layer from IBM Web Commerce, and pretty happy to report that it wasn't without hitch, but it did largely see the improvements we wanted on the early stages. However, it's worth pointing out that all those little white arrows were actually generated as HTTP REST communications, which now we've probably learned a little bit more about how serverless works, and the benefits we can get from asynchronous communication meant that of this architecture, there were lots of bottlenecks, there was lots of latency, there was lots of communication chains that relied on several layers deep communication of services to then report back to the customer. So we had to relook at it. But we'd already adopted an event-driven approach, but it was within a service. So what I've put on screen now is a very arbitrary event-driven service where you're consuming an API request and you're processing it, and it becomes asynchronous, communicating with other APIs or even a DynamoDB or a data store to achieve the purpose. But this led to a more highly coupled architecture. It meant that services were still kind of dependent on each other. Maybe the deployment process could be separated, but ultimately they still had a level of dependency, and it included unnecessary latency, which we, at the time of engineering the previous slides and the HTTP requests, we weren't really aware of. But it also ultimately was providing performance impacts to the customer, and we all know time is money. So what we're targeting towards today is something similar to this. So with a more event-driven approach using the latest release of the Event Bridge that came during our journey of transformation to serverless, we're able to publish events from product, checkout, order, and fulfillment, and begin communicating asynchronously to enable us to act in the best interest of the customer, to return the information to the customer that they require to perform the action. But also any downstream processes can be involved, but ultimately it's not the product's responsibility to talk to checkout anymore. It's not checkout's responsibility to talk to product or fulfillment. They can listen to the correct events and act accordingly. Within those microservices, there's a whole heap of other event-driven asynchronous processes, but that's to do with the domain logic that they have and they hold, but they can ultimately publish messages externally to a shared event bus. But to achieve, as we move through, we were learning. There was a lot of how do we move forward at pace without having to constantly pick on the finer details to make sure we'd achieved what we needed to, because ultimately we needed to perform as a business. By making it a longer process to achieve an MVP, it was going to become more costly. So along the way, we developed guidelines, we learned from the community, we learned from internally, and we arrived at several patterns, of which some are on screen now, which we were able to deploy, and everybody in the business, as we grew the teams, knew how that worked. So when you came to reviewing architecture, when you came to discussing a solution on a technical level, you were able to put these patterns in, and the room almost felt silent to a degree, because it may have not been the best solution, it may have not always been the right solution, or the most performant, but it allowed us to build at pace. And by bringing things asynchronously in these two that are shown on screen, it meant that we had a few easy things out of the box. So it was an easily recognizable route of data. So the Lambda invocates, it calls SNS, and the rest is kind of history in terms of the common understanding of how that would work, how the performance works, maybe even a few shared packages on inner sourcing style model across our engineers. But also to kind of satisfy the site once it was live, it provided agreed traceability and agreed observability, with also failure resilience in mind, because it is an asynchronous process. So dead letter queues were pretty much our best friend. But let's say it did save us a few times. There have been situations where deployments have happened, systems have been taken offline. I remember one instance where the orders were not processing through our system, but thank goodness there was a dead letter queue there, because it meant as soon as we applied the fixing forward mentality, we were able to recover every single message, and being asynchronous to a degree, customers still received their order and almost didn't know it's a thing. Now, I'm going to flip back to tell you about the culture that we did to achieve that architecture, because the architecture alone wasn't necessarily going to be something that you could just stand up. People needed to mold and flex towards a serverless mindset rather than engineering within a specific container style. So when we started, we built up 4 component teams. They had domain ownership of each of the one on the screen, and we were able to bring in SMEs, whether they were contractors or whether they were actually existing in the business, to understand the business processes. But ultimately, it allowed us to move fast with huge progress and see a fantastic output towards that September 2019 date. However, this did cause some challenges along the way. It enforced more siloed working practices. There was cross-team dependencies. The coordination between those component teams was a bit of a headache. Knowledge of how things were done, which I mentioned we were new into the serverless space, there was not really a way for the browse team and the checkout team. There was no ceremony, there was no reason for them to communicate, maybe around the odd feature or API here and there. So the knowledge of how we were iterating on our knowledge within serverless wasn't shared. But given the component teams developing component systems, there was still a large level of testing that was required. We hadn't really ticked the boxes of moving away from a monolith and gaining that confidence that deployment would happen and having confidence that it would work. So there was still a large level of testing. But developing a roadmap and features that required cross-team collaboration became a lot more of a challenge. We've had situations where browse and trade have got a fully stacked quarter ready to go. They know exactly what they're doing, but checkout need a bit of work that involves browse or trade. So think of payment options. So to reveal more payment options online, we may need a few of those teams to work collaboratively and understand how they can reveal it. They can process the order, for example, and stamping those relevant information all the way through the system. So that did cause us a bit of a problem. So on the way, we understood a bit of a serverless, an engineer mindset to become a serverless engineer mindset. And there's 3 core elements to that, 2 of which are on screen, and I'll move on to the next one shortly. And that was how we approach things. So upfront design, but equally it was more about the mindset and how we approached it. So every service should be becoming more modular. They shouldn't have reliance on other systems. Maybe they were shared data sources, but ultimately it was working within a bounded context and striving to publish each contract so that every other team knew and every other system knew exactly what was revealed. Did it need work to achieve the feature they wanted, or was the current API sufficient? They were independent, so it can be tested on a microservice level. And as we went through, you extend and include the integrations where relevant, which ultimately drove quite a small microservice and allowed for those pipelines, for that developer feedback to be ultimately really quick. As you move through time, they get longer and longer. But at the time, we were moving pretty quick. Extensibility, so we don't have a crystal ball. If every engineer had a crystal ball, we wouldn't necessarily need to be sat here today. But to have that mindset of how can the next person come along and plug in and play exactly what feature they want. If you were in the talk next door, Luca mentioned the hexagonal design of services, and that's kind of very much what I'm alluding to is how are you building the service with that in mindset? What if your data source changes? Maybe you need a different one. Maybe it isn't performant as you need. But thinking about the extensibility was a key unlock for async computing and the big move towards event-driven architecture, because you could all of a sudden start consuming messages that other people were publishing and act on it rather than relying on a little nudge via an API request. And a good example of that is we use SAP as our ERP, and they were providing us with a product feed. So in the early stages, the product feed would be consumed by the adapter that we'd built ourselves in batches of 100 and passed on, potentially in the batches of 100, to multiple microservices via HTTP. But ultimately, that was causing problems with, well, I don't want all the information, or this is too much information, I can't deal with it in a batch. So we've since moved on from that, and we're now moving towards consuming the batch of 100, immediately breaking that batch down to 100 to 1, and then any microservice that's available that wants that information, be it based on category, based on price, based on stock levels, can reach out and just use that message where required. Because ultimately, the product feed we had, it's not customer facing. It can be completely asynchronous. Obviously, the end game is to put that product in front of a customer, but it's not a customer journey that we need to make synchronous. And then the third one is standardization. So with standardization, I'm going to throw a bit of an analogy here. I'm not quite sure it'll work, but we'll try. So everyone likes cake. If you see the big system as cake, that cake's in a box. You can't cut that cake up and you travel with that cake. You can't just travel it in your hand. There's that would be messy. You want to carry it maybe in a box. Maybe the box needs a window so you can check on it as you're traveling to make sure it's not getting too hot, it's not melting, it's not falling over. And hopefully, as I move forward, you'll see where those boxes, the windows, and the temperature, et cetera, could fit in. Because with standardization, in large organizations like Dunelm, we have teams for security that are dedicated to security. They are experts in security. We have site reliability engineers, we have site operations engineers, platform engineers that all want to and should have a say on our platform. But we don't embed them in the teams because the teams of the Agile 2 Pizza team would grow, and a lot of those people would not necessarily need to have input every day of the week. So having them on standby to call on their expertise when required was really useful. But with standardization, we can move forward without change approval boards, and actually providing the smaller teams that we do have with autonomy. If they can engineer in a way where security is taken care of, maybe they need to have an idea of it, but they don't need to understand the finer implementation details. But they can just get on board with it and utilize it if it's made available in an easy way. So for that standardization, I've got 5 topics. I think it's 5. So logging is a clear one, actually really important. But what are you logging? What payload are you logging? What data are you including in that? But how are you doing it securely? What to log? When to log? You don't really want PII data leaking across the platform in front of engineers in that sense, because the less people that see it, maybe you redact it, maybe you don't include it at all. But at least it means that you can find the problem without necessarily having the details of customer in front of you. CI/CD. So for us, a standard CI/CD was really important because of those external teams that want to put the additional rigor around our services to make sure we're compliant with security. We are in the best possible stance when it comes to communication between systems from our platform team via things like VPCs. So for us, we've collaborated and worked together to develop our CI/CD pipeline. So every single one of our microservices is using the same, within reason, the same CI/CD pipeline. Some are striving towards that continuous deployment. Some are putting in manual steps just because of the level of, not the engineering capability, but the level of delicacy is required. Maybe one system can be completely deployed because it's a newsletter sign-up. Maybe one system is checkout, for example. You want that additional checkpoint to make sure you're not continuously deploying at peak hour on a Friday afternoon, for example. Testing. I'm going to skip that one today. I hope you don't mind, because that could leave us here until probably this evening. And I know everyone loves a good testing conversation. So tracing. Tracing is very different when it comes to a distributed system. And ultimately, if you get tracing right, I'm a great belief that if you know what the request was at the top level and can trace it all the way down to the bottom in a distributed system, you're probably in a pretty good stance to start finding where that erroneous payload was, or that use case that the customer found that maybe you didn't think of. So having that really allows for a quick solution, or at least a quick understanding of where the problems may lie. And then finally, monitoring. So with that SRE, with that SOE mindset, how were we deploying particularly Lambdas in this sense, because all of the other systems we utilize are baked into AWS. So it's basically our code that is the risk in certain circumstances. So by deploying a Lambda, what we're wrapping around it, for us, we wrap a layer using a third-party APM, and we create two views, really. Hopefully, infrastructure as code. I know we're certainly on the way to that. But we create dashboards and we create alerts. Dashboards to let us know how the system is performing over time. Can we spot anything that we can improve in the future on regular review? Or alerts, if someone's trying to buy a pair of curtains at 3 a.m., the alert will alert the team, we can solve the problem, or at least make sure that customer has successfully purchased their curtains. But I'm really aware that standardization isn't necessarily the solution that's going to work with all engineering teams. So in order for our teams to be still innovative, still working within the latest, greatest technologies, be it within AWS or outside of AWS, we see these more as guidelines and guardrails. So when you're developing, maybe you bring a new pattern to add to that pattern library that I showed earlier, or maybe you think that Lambda isn't what we need for this and it's something else. Having those guardrails and guidelines in place has allowed the engineer that's bringing the innovative piece to know what is required when it hits production. So maybe it's they did it in an afternoon playing around, but ultimately, if it's going to make it into production, along with an agreement from the team, they need to be adhering to largely these standards, or at least expecting these conversations to come up when it comes to how do we productionize this piece of innovation. So it does allow for freedom, but it does also mean that we are deploying exactly the same platform. So that's alluding to the box of the cake. By wrapping it in a box, you know exactly what you're shipping, and all of the teams that are concerned about that service, and all of the people that could potentially be woken up at 3 a.m. have a coherent way of analyzing the outputs. So moving on to today. So as we've gone through time, those 4 component teams serve the purpose, but we did move to a larger view. As we recruited more people, we believe that the knowledge share was required. So today's view, you may think this looks similar. If I said it was the Spotify model, that's the way we've largely adopted. So our chapters, which are the green boxes range from engineering to quality to business analysts to product, and within those, the SRE security guys and those kind of teams fit as well. This structure was a huge catalyst for high-performing, passionate teams because they were able to communicate with each other, as we have over 20 teams and 200 members. And that performance and that passion of delivering the best possible solution, it kind of goes a long way. Along that, we have focus areas. So rather than component teams which are dedicated to working on a specific piece, focus areas are a bit broader, and they allow us to have teams within them that are focused on delivering value and features in a specific area, but not constrained to you are only working in this domain. The other benefit we've had is the guilds and forums. So for us, guilds and forums are a way to gather together. It doesn't have to be engineers, doesn't have to be any particular requirement for that guild, but it's to showcase innovation. And that has been a huge way for us to shift and adopt better patterns and move towards something that's either performance, cost efficient, or many other different areas. But also it's sharing knowledge. Not everyone that works within those teams is a serverless expert. We tend to work on a full stack engineer, but it's very much a T-shaped engineering model where you've got the depth of knowledge, maybe it's React, maybe it's databases, but you've got the breadth across the piece. And your team will be complementing that with their own skill set. But it's not always a formal demo or a presentation or some documentation. It can be anything you want. It can be 10 minutes, it can be 5 minutes. We're really not in a forum that you have to meet criteria to display this, because people operate in different ways. And because of that, naturally, the great ideas that come forward will move forward and go to production or be picked up and moved on in their advancement of the innovation. But other ideas can be put on the shelf for a later time. And these have been things like our event-driven architecture approach, our API approach, and how we're moving these forward. So I'm working as one of the guilds I'm part of is the event-driven architecture. So how do we move that across the business of 200 people with 20 teams? How do you standardize that approach? How do you make sure that everyone's involved in the standards, but also doesn't feel like they're missing out on making a decision? If this isn't something that looks familiar to what you have, I'm not saying it's something you should adopt straight away on a move to serverless from a monolithic application, but it has certainly worked for Dunelm. There may be some nuances between the exact Spotify model and the way we're working today, but it allows us to keep inwardly looking and improving the process between teams and maybe even between focus areas and so on and so forth. As part of the change forward, I believe that we've had to move the conversation on. The technical piece is one thing that many people are super passionate about, and how we adopt it and how we innovate around that space. But it doesn't just happen with a technical lens. So a large part of adopting serverless was speaking with the business and getting them on board on how iteration works, what serverless means, how those costs can be reduced. Cost always seems to be a good leading path when talking to parts of the business, but also listening to their concerns. So as we moved across from the monolith, there was into a serverless, there was all those questions around absolutely valid concerns that we couldn't just shut down and put in the corner. And the what ifs, it was better to bring them along the journey and showcase how it worked. And although we needed to make them aware that we were forging a new path, at the time of adopting serverless, it was new. Internally, we didn't really know how it would turn out. But as we brought them along the journey, they were a lot more forgiving and a lot more understanding of how, when facing a challenge, it wasn't a matter of you've done it before, you can do it again. It was a very steep learning curve for everyone. And focusing really on having the right people in the room. So sometimes we fall foul of larger businesses, including person on a hierarchical level and going through and passing on the message, which can get diluted. But just bringing the right people in the room to make the decision allows you for a really useful conversation rather than having to revisit it back 2 weeks later because you didn't really get the point across. And trusting people. So as I mentioned, we didn't have the expertise, so we hired new people. Naturally, new people to a business aren't always the loudest people in the room, but actually listening to their expertise that they've built up somewhere else or through their own time. And then also listening to the experts in Dunelm. So processes that existed, I mentioned earlier CSVs, but some of those processes you can take away and really diving deep on the process that they want to achieve, not the process that they are doing, really helps you to optimize the technical output and a solution to what we need. But also just the collaboration and conversation, it doesn't stop when you deliver something. To kind of replay it back and dive into, have we achieved what we wanted to achieve? What can we do next? That kind of MVP approach. But one final metric that I want to wrap up today, which I think I've scooted around a little bit, and certainly something I'm proud of by working for the Dunelm in the serverless space, is that 2 deployments per month through the serverless adoption, our partnership with AWS, the serverless mindset shift that we achieved, the focus on the culture, as well as the technology, has taken that 2 times per month of deployment of a monolith to up to and around 240 times a month, because we have a multiple modular, extendable, largely standardized services. And that is it for me today. So hopefully that's sent you on a bit of a journey around part 1 with the technical approach we took to achieving a microservice architecture in serverless, and then also the complementing culture that we shifted through towards to becoming quite a high-paced, technical, feature-driven environment. Thank you.
Any questions for Mark?
How do you deal with ownership and cost allocation? Does every squad or every tribe have its own account? Do you run cost allocation tags? And how do you deal with moving a component across a squad or a tribe, or having a squad disbanded?
Cool. It's quite difficult to hear because I think speakers face in that way. So what I got from that was, how do we control the ownership between services and squads? Is that correct? Yeah. So it's actually a very, very present challenge we've got today. And I think when we think about all the agile practices that engineers take on board, part of those we've missed things. And I think a key one that we've missed that would enable this to go faster and in a better way is documentation. So on the understanding that we tend to work on an understanding that if your feature requires a change to a service, it's your responsibility to go and make that change. There are owners, there are approvers on a pull request, there are code owners, but as you say, churn and as people move around teams causes a bit of a bottleneck to it becomes a person that has the knowledge as opposed to a group of people. So really, we're trying to tackle that very, very present at the minute, which is just documenting better. Whether that be documenting how to run the service locally or documenting the API to a degree where you can look at the service and go, that does exactly what I need, or ask more informed questions. I think the worst thing you can do is approach a service and go and be unable to ask an informed question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You mentioned publishing contracts quite early on. Do you folks do anything in terms of contract testing, or if you've got more to kind of to follow on from that question, to enable you're not breaking or you can choose?
No, I don't think we have it as something we could hang our hat on today. It's something we're investigating. It's something that we believe is required for a microservice architecture to avoid the coupling of systems in an end-to-end test. Obviously, end-to-end tests and integration tests are highly expensive, both in time and cost. So how do we bring that to a lower level? But contract testing is something we're definitely on our radar to achieve.
Hi, I'm currently in a very similar structured business with around 200 employees in the squads structure. We're finding communication between the squads really difficult. I was wondering if you had any tips, tricks, hacks for that.
So for us, we run some of those forums extend wider. So we run a forum that is a technical design review. It's not an approval board, but it's something that every engineer is allowed to attend, almost recommended to attend, to share those technical decisions and those technical knowledge. And that brings people together when people can see architecture that they maybe want to be more interested about. They can go and ask the questions, but also if they've got a solution, they've got a better solution that they want to propose, or even they've got the same problem they want to collaborate and work together. So it's opportunities like that when the features come through and the solutions. There's some things where we see it as it's really good to see what architecture we've got going into our platform, but equally it's a place where other engineers can ask those questions and really dive in. So it's building out, I think in a hybrid world it's quite difficult, but building out those forums that are loosely agendaed but drive that conversation forward. Giving the guy a workout.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, good talk. It's quite similar to what we're going through our company. We're sort of in the middle of it. Just wanted to understand what observability tools you use, how you sort of came to choose them, because I know you mentioned that you use some third-party tools.
Yeah, so we use Datadog currently, and we farm everything from our platform across the Datadog in various different ways, whether it be log forwarding, Lambda layer extensions, and various other pipeline integrations to track changes. And we found that really useful to alerting and monitoring. And
okay. Did you check a few out before, or did you just go straight with that one?
I believe early days we used New Relic as a solution. I don't know the reasons personally why we made the shift. But yeah, that's our current chosen provider. Okay. And it works well for us. It's a really intuitive UI, and it allows us to empower the teams to build their own monitors because they will know the best place that the monitors could be required.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I was just wondering if you could kind of summarize your repository split, whether you kind of have individual repositories for the different code repositories for the different modules, or whether you have a monorepo set up, and just a brief summary of how you kind of deploy those separate modules on it.
So we have a mixture, which is probably not. It depends is probably the greatest answer, right? But I think the majority of ours is monorepo, and they're typically split by. Well, it's a microservice. It's typically split by stack and responsibility of that stack. One example would be our order processor. There's multiple stacks, but the two key ones are incoming data and outgoing data, and how they pass it between the two. So we've got a common way to send it out and a common way to receive it in. Just worth adding to that one. Sorry, and also is each microservice with a monorepo allows for us to add kind of shared packages within that as well. So there's probably within those services there's common use cases of how we it's a good example of that. How we process a particular payload. Maybe two places need to do it, so we'll create that in a monorepo, share that as a package because it's responsible within that microservice, but not required by anyone else. So it allows for that as well. It's quite nice.
Hi there. Yeah. So we have a similar structure. Rather than communicating with HTTP requests, we generally put events directly onto the queues that we need. And I was just wondering, what was the driver to move towards EventBridge to kind of handle that as a full package as opposed to, say, doing that yourself?
Sorry, repeat the last bit.
So what was the driver towards using EventBridge kind of eventually to use the full management for the events rather than, say, putting events onto the topics that you need via SNS?
I think it was the broader conversation and the coupling we were almost achieving by accident of the topics would need to be shared between repositories, and then if that microservice was to be deleted for any reason or removed and a new stack was provided or slightly tweaked, you end up leaking kind of implementation details because you need to attach to a specific SNS topic or SQS, whereas EventBridge it's a layer that's removed from you. You know what message you need, you know what payload to expect based on schemas, and that allows for a broader cross communication. It also surfaces or enables us to communicate with our data teams as well, because they can pretty much just hook onto one place and receive all the data they need and filter their side. It's not a fence thing, but they can filter what they need and ingest what they need and discard the rest, whereas we may need it internally.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Is there, last quick question.
How do you implement your standardization? Is it documentation, code snippets, templates, or are you looking at something like custom libraries to implement?
So we tend to write custom libraries that remove any of that kind of implementation detail. So we've got several common libraries for Lambda that we would spins up to include things like power tools or our logging standards or security standards. We've started to move into the CDK space. That takes it one level higher and allows us to if all of our Lambdas need VPC, the VPC is provided. If we need certain tagging requirements for Cost Explorer or security, it's done for you. Or it's not necessarily done for you, but it prompts you to make the decision. We can make tags required. We can fit our pipelines based upon you're not telling us what data is storing in this database, for example. Is it PII? Is it not? Is it public? Is it highly confidential? And that allows us to work through those both on a resource level of AWS, but also within a package for Lambda for compute.
Who's responsible for managing and writing those libraries?
The priority.
No, who's responsible for writing those libraries in your team
Writing.
structure?
It's an engineering chapter thing. We have the security experts, the SRE experts. They can provide us with the requirements to work on. And as we've moved through that space, it's been iterative. It's not been, this is your logging standard from day one. It's been, we should probably log, and then we should probably log with this data because it's really useful, and then just organically growing, and then recommending that package that one team has created because they were in the depths of creating the problem at the time, and informing other teams that this library is available to be used and to look to use it. So it's organic growth as opposed to mandated throughout the piece.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's us out of time. So if you have more questions, please come and try to grab Mark and continue the chat. Next up in this room is Ben Pollard talking about CDK and team topologies in 10 minutes. But thank you very much, Mark.